Hello, my friends. You are back again. I'm so excited. We are on 21 or 20 of the 28 scheduled instructional overviews and review sessions of AP Government Live. I'm so excited. Yay. I know you are too. Let's get going, shall we? You know who I am. It's Miss Hitch. I'm here live from a basement in Northern Virginia, ready to talk to you about our final day of bureaucracy, taking a look at how the bureaucracy, that is such a hard word for me to say, is influenced by other branches. Here we go. First of all, Faith has been Faith, you have so many questions and I love it. And they're great questions. We had a continuation of the question yesterday about whether or not someone can have a bench trial refused. The next question that popped up after that, which was tangential, was about the difference of powers in nomination and appointing. And there we had a long conversation also that I thought was really kind of fun, in terms of it illuminates the fact that the Constitution it's words, it's a body of words that are rules that are written down, and we have some inkling in terms of how the founding fathers felt about them, and we have stayed true to those things as we felt we should, and we have deviated through formal and informal changes. But when we look at the text of the Constitution, there's still some really just fun things that are happening in terms of just grammar, right? Like the way things are written, and there was a committee of style that was one of the last things that was happening at the Constitutional Convention, in which they went through and they kind of organized things by ideas. And then they also spent a ton of time thinking about how to compose these various bundles of powers that are delegated from the people to the federal government. And so every comma and every space, the way things are compiled in terms of powers, all of those things mean something. And oftentimes when we're listening to the news media talk about things like appointment powers, we get a very sifted vision of that, right? A very simplified vision where they're like, let's just skim off the top. This is what you need to know. But when you dig deeper, it's not often as simple as it seems. And that's fine. Like the news media doesn't have time to talk to you about the complications between the appointment versus nomination powers in Article 2, Section 2. And why would they, right? Most people would be like, I don't care. But when you really dig down into it, you see that there's like a separation there and they mean something slightly different. So we went back and forth about how this is separated, why the grammar and language is so important in Article 2, Section 2. And really that kind of brings us to almost every single conversation we have in government. It's really based on how we understand things that are written down, because we have a written constitution, we have a codified system of laws that are written, and we have to draw conclusions based on them, because oftentimes they don't take into account every single possible thing that could ever happen. In some cases, it gets down to where commas fall. So all of you who are in lit or lang, I'm going to drop this thing about the Oxford comma and the controversy that comes with that. And I want you to know that there was a Supreme Court case that dealt with the Oxford comma and what it meant. And it was a case going back to state law in Maine, having to do with dairy trucking. And that's what they talked about, was like, what does an Oxford comma mean? How does it help us understand what this law is supposed to allow and what it's not supposed to allow? So that makes things so, I mean, I think it's infinitely fun, right? But I am a nerd and I know that. So, got to own it. All right. Iris asked a question about the necessary and proper clause in Article 1, Section 8 yesterday, asking if the executive branch can justify presidential implied powers through that. And my answer is almost 100% no. Remember that anytime the president acts, they have to act with some kind of authorization from Congress, right? There has to be a law behind it. The president cannot operate in a vacuum. with the exception of emergency powers, right? And there are some powers that he's given where he has preemption in certain things, even like commander in chief when he's defending the nation's interest when we are under attack. Yes, the president has the ability to be commander in chief, but even there, the founding fathers made a very distinctive difference in the way that they organize powers between their experience with Great Britain and their experience under the American Constitution. If you were to go back to Great Britain, you would notice that the king had the authority to exercise powers as commander in chief, but he also was responsible as declaring war and supporting, raising revenue to support the troops. And those three things, those three bundles of powers right there, have a profound ability to expand the president's ability, or I'm sorry, the king's ability to engage in warfare that maybe was incongruent with the desires of the people who would be fighting those wars, the human capital that was on the field, right? So that distinguishment to make that decision gives the president the ability to respond, to react to anything that's in a defensive matter, and to some degree today, even offensive, but still accountable to going back to Congress and having a conversation about what should be done in the long term about those. And you guys know that comes from the War Powers Resolution of 1973. All right, so here's our homework for last night. You were to take a look at this FRQ. And again, a lot of you are asking why there's some, not so much this one, but why some of these have are dipping into units 4 and 5. And I want you to remember that I want to be able to have you be exposed to all of the material. And while College Board has said that they will go and look only at units 1 through 3 on the exam, we're going to practice the things that College Board has available for us so that we're all on the same page and so that we're still clicking through 4 and 5 and seeing how 4 and 5 intermeshes with 1, 2, and 3. Okay. So here is our prompt. Again, if you haven't read it, hit pause. I am going to move forward here. So we have here describing the role of the Securities and Exchange Commission in the context of the scenario. And I've pulled down a student response from Twitter. I just have one today. And I think that we have a really great description of what the Securities and Exchange Commission's mission is. Fantastic. But this is a really important missing piece, especially when we're looking at how these things interrelate. You have to be able to identify what it is. So in this case, I really needed to see that this was an independent regulatory commission so that I understand that it's in the federal bureaucracy, that it has a different relationship and powers between Congress and the president, so on and so forth. So make sure that you're identifying what those things are, right? I couldn't tell based on this if this was a committee in Congress, if this was something in the states, if this was a special interest group. You need to be able to like point at it and say, this is what it is, and this is their mission. So that's another example of where identify and describe really helps you increase the odds of doing well. B, everything else was great. Their explain was fantastic, but I still don't know what it is, so I couldn't give the point. B, describe and explain how Congress can affect the SEC's acts in the role described in Part A. So they have a lovely description of what Congress can do. We're naming something. It's pretty concrete. Investigation, still a little watery. I would love to hear hearings or requesting information, but I felt as though for the most part, this was pretty good. So here, if we look at this, and if Elon Musk had the right to tweet what he did despite its repercussions, they go on to elaborate and explain in the second part what, oops, that's repeat. So just kidding. That's a wonderful explanation. So very good. That's a point awarded on B. And then for C, suppose there's a vacant seat on the Securities and Exchange Commission, the issue of the scenario is still pending. So here we're looking at how the process can be impacted. Sorry, I have a light flickering. That's lovely. It's very distracting. And here you had option. You could talk about, because we're talking about oversight and accountability. Oversight is something we associate only with Congress. Accountability is something we might associate with the president. Here you could have talked about one or the other, and the student chose to talk about both, right? And they gave a clear explanation as to what description of oversight, what it was, showing how that would control the issue of selecting a new commissioner, so on and so forth. So it's a 2 out of 3 for the student sample. Very nice. Just remember, again, our big takeaway from this is to identify, describe, and explain to increase the odds that you are saying the right things. I know that it's not necessarily in the rubric, the scoring guidelines. I should say it's not a rubric, it's a scoring guideline. However, the more you talk, the more likely you are to get the right words out, right? Especially if we're rushing, if we have less words, we're probably less likely to complete our thoughts. So write the whole 15 minutes. And you'll see me do that again today. Okay, we are gonna go back to the bureaucracy. And I started off thinking about this unit, about how we have talked about the bureaucracy over the past 5 years or so. And living in the Washington, D.C. area, I have to say that I actually, number one, I am a part of state bureaucracy because I am a teacher, so that goes without saying. But so many of my friends are either directly employed by the federal government or they are government contractors. And for a time, I served as a government contractor and worked to support the federal bureaucracy. I worked for the EPA. And so I have a lot of firsthand knowledge and insight into what the life and intents of a bureaucrat are. And I have to say, from my perspective, the way in which we talk about bureaucrats has been surprising. I don't, some of the terminology that we use or that we hear about the intent of the bureaucracy has been in place and has been in operation since the late 1800s. This is kind of the outgrowth of decisions that were made a long, long time ago to try to put the best people in the positions where they are going to retain institutional knowledge to assist us in the execution of day-to-day law. So, and on top of that, I should point out that every single person who works for the federal government swears an oath, or has an kind of like an oath of office. And that oath of office is not tied to Congress. It's not tied to the president. Every single individual has to swear an oath to the Constitution. So that is our controlling law here. That is, again, going back to limited government and rule of law, everyone is accountable to that document and to the understandings that we have from it, and not accountable to parties or individual office holders or anything along those lines. So with that in mind, I want you to kind of wrap your head around the size of the federal workforce. And we're not talking about just in Washington, D.C. and the surrounding counties. We're talking about all throughout the country. In fact, one of the things, especially when you're talking about active duty military, one of the really interesting things is that the active duty militaries, both their personnel are from every single county in the country and beyond. As a matter of fact, I believe the #1 recruiting station is from this, it's either the North Mauritania or the American Samoas. I think it's the American Samoas, where per capita, the most individuals will sign up for the services. In addition to that, their supply chain has somebody somewhere in every single county, certainly in every single state, who's manufacturing something to support our military. So it's a huge workforce. It's a huge source of employment. It's a huge source of upward mobility for people. It's also our defense, things along those lines, which are interesting. Beyond that, we also have our civilian agencies and departments, and I pulled this down from a website called governing.org, which has a longer list, and you can scroll down if you go to that. It's in my works cited for today, and it just gives you a grasp on the size of our federal bureaucracy. We look at departments of Veterans Affairs, that might be surprising to you, but remember, this is the only federalized hospital system that we have, is through the U.S. military and through the departments of Veterans Affairs. So it shouldn't be surprising, because there we're talking about medical professionals who are as we speak, responding to COVID-19. You have the civilian employees of Department of Army, Navy, Air Force, so on and so forth, which they have tons of civilian employees who are there helping out, carrying out the functions and supporting the active duty military, IRS, and it just kind of rolls down from there. So we're talking about a huge workforce, right? Depending on how you count them, and this is excluding the United States Postal Service, which right now is in the news because it is a government corporation, about whether or not the government should continue to support these services. That is our nation's one of the oldest departments that goes back to the founding and was a critically important component of being able to educate people, being able to facilitate communications, so on and so forth, facilitate our economy. All of those things are embedded in the services offered by the U.S. Postal Service, but we're not counting them in this tabulation of total federal employment. So again, going back to last class, we talked about how these individuals are very much so, through bureaucratic discretion and the rulemaking policies put in place, involved in adding specificity and detail to so many of our laws that are intentionally written with wiggle room, so that the process of legislating, which is very laborious and requires a lot of compromise and a lot of time, in addition to technological advances and the necessity for subject matter expertise, can be left to individuals who retain those things and have a better understanding of how these bureaucratic rules and regulations feel on the ground as they're being enforced. Just to review a couple of things, going back to sections, I think to 212, we should note, the bureaucracy has 4 different components. We see that it has a hierarchical authority structure. Think of our our line agencies. They feature task specialization, where they're delegating authority to do specific tasks down the hill, so to speak. They have operation based on merit principle, so we're promoting people because they are qualified, and then it behaves with impersonality. So to me, what that means is that you can expect to receive services regardless of who you are, because they are providing a service and they actually call you clients, depending on what you're doing. If I were, like, my husband works for the federal government, and when he's referring to people that he's working with external to his agency, or even other offices within his agency, he refers to them as clients. And that's a really important thing to think about, is that they're there to serve, right, whatever that political goal of that policy is. And so I feel like sometimes that can be a little surprising to hear people refer to it as that. There's also a couple of ways, or different ways, in which we're going to sort these different bureaucracies. So the first and foremost, and again, going back to our kind of like concentric circles thing from yesterday, is cabinet departments. So we're talking about, those are the largest organizations. They have the largest mission. They have the highest rank. They're in the cabinet. They have an informal role of advising the president. And yes, the president does go ahead and call them to order, but for the most part, I mean, how a president might use the cabinet is really left to their discretion. There's a couple different models. Some of them have very hierarchical structures, in which you kind of have to go to the gatekeeper of the president. That would be the president's chief of staff, and they're going to make a lot of decisions about who could go and have a conversation with the president and who can't. So that's a really critically important kind of gatekeeping position within the executive branch. There's another one that was used by Kennedy and Clinton to some degree. I believe it was Clinton, although Clinton makes me feel a little leery on that one, called spokes and wheels, where they would kind of encourage debate between different subject matter experts, whether they were in the White House office or whether or not they were cabinet level position holders, to kind of talk out and debate the key points of various different policy or administrative decisions that are made by the president, kind of creating a sense of competition and sometimes stress, and having to debate to influence the president's decision. But it's just a style, and using the cabinet, executive office of the president, so on and so forth, to help illuminate the best policy decisions. Kennedy is definitely the one that is most associated with that. You also have independent executive agencies like NASA, where they are not in a overarching large mission cabinet department. They often are appointed by the president, serve at the president's pleasure, and they have discreter tasks than what you might see come out of the cabinet. Independent regulatory commissions are agencies who have primary functions to impose limits or restrictions or other obligations on the conduct of individuals or companies in that private sector. And they usually feature a board instead of that hierarchical structure. And the board will have an even or odd number of people appointed to it who serve at the president's behest, but they have to be politically balanced, is generally how Congress writes the structure of that board of commissioners, so that you are able to balance those issues as we come across things with the Securities and Exchange Commission, high functioning, really critically important part of economic regulation, the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Elections Commissions, National Labor Review Board, like all of those things, very, very sensitive functions that they have. So you want to make sure that they're balanced politically is the compromise that has been made. And then finally, the last one is government corporations. So think Amtrak, U.S. Postal Service, Tennessee Valley Authority. Those are traditional ones that we're thinking of, where it's pseudo private sector, pseudo public sector, kind of depends. And then of course, because Congress has the authority to create agencies as they want, and they're responding to political issues, and they're trying to determine how much effect they have on controlling the output, we're talking about broad categories that when you get down into the 400 some odd bureaucratic agencies that actually populate the federal government, they're all going to be a little different. And so these are just kind of the four broad categories that we have. And we see that their missions, their composition, all of those things change depending on really what Congress was concerned about at the time, because all of these things are there to accomplish a political goal. So who are they responsible to, the bureaucracy? This is a really important question, and I kind of skipped over this last class. We had said, again, that at the core, the White House office, that is the most loyal bureaucrats, they're staff agencies, they're there to support, and they're really thinking of task-oriented. They're the press secretary, the chief of the chief of staff, all those different things where they're really there to create a specific function. And then you get out into advisors outside of that, executive office of the president, that the president can pick up or move depending on the political will. Sometimes we've heard them refer to, they might pick individuals who have very discrete areas of expertise. They're sometimes called czars, who are there to help kind of come up with strategy of how to direct the administration and policy goals for things, you know, that run the gamut. Drug czars, all different kinds of things. So you sometimes hear that in the press. The other issue here is that as you go out, right, Congress there is making decisions to create structures where there's less presidential authority as you kind of move out of the White House office and executive office of the president. So we talked last class about staff versus line agencies, and this isn't the perfect org chart, but this is the official org chart of our federal government. And I love that at the top, do you see it? The Constitution reigns supreme, right? That gets back to limited government and rule of law. Super, I mean, like it is right there on the page staring at you going, here I am, don't you forget about me. I hope you're singing now. So why would Congress want to make it hard for the president to do their job? That's a really, really great question. And what you need to recall is that I said it earlier that we've had a merit-based system since the 1880s, roughly. And that was a response during the progressive era to it kind of previous historical trends that go back to Andrew Jackson and the spoils system. And what that is it's pay to play, it's quid pro quo. It's you do this and I give you a cool, cushy job. One of the coolest jobs in the whole country was to be the to be in the postal service. If you were the, the guy or the girl who was in charge of your local postal service, you had a really important function. It was oftentimes the hub of information. It was necessary to have in most incorporated towns and cities. It was where commerce would happen. You could have general stores. People would travel there, and it was a federal agency that was embedded in the community. So it was a really critically important job to have, and it was a lucrative position that was handed out as parties were able to kind of start to consolidate voters and to reach voters. That was one of the spoils systems, not surprises, but prizes that were handed out to individuals who were loyal to the president in office. And so they're sweet, sweet government jobs, right? And so they're going to use them to support them. And the crazy thing is that there was an expectation that that person holding that office would continue to be partisan while they were in that position, that it was, that it wasn't a secret which presidential candidate or which party they supported. They had, their hands on the strings of the party structure in that locality. They were absolutely fabulous at identifying campaign fundraising, at identifying potential voters, issues that are bubbling to the surface. So it became a really great way for parties to keep in power. And we saw a reaction to this starting in 1882 with the Pendleton Civil Service Act, and a lot of this has to do with the Gilded Age and some of the big party machines, especially we're seeing out of cities like Chicago. If you've ever read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, it's a fantastic example of just how party machines work in the locality. They're super good at identifying voters. They get it down based on like, what language do you speak? Where do you live? What do you do? How do you get these people to show up to vote? Take them to a bar, hand them a ballot, give them a beer, vote for my candidate. So this reaction to this between Chicago and New York City was the Pendleton Civil Service Act, and it was a way to democratize the process and to take some of the issues of parties, or remember, factions, James Madison, and dull them a little bit. So we are going to break from this, and we're going to go towards a merit-based system for appointing inferior officers. Not that they are less important, but they have less authority constitutionally or delegated by Congress. They're also going to establish the Civil Service Commission and curb things like solicitations for funds or votes at the federal workplace. So this will continue through, we'll add another layer to this in 1939 with the Hatch Act. This is another major legislative overhaul. We've had small ones in between these three. They're not the only three, but they're the three of the most significant. So the Hatch Act of 1939 is going to go further by banning activities of federal employees and appointed officials. So saying that they can't do things like use public funds for election activities, that if you are in a public position, you cannot engage in campaign activities, that while you're holding that public position, you cannot run for office. You have to step down from that bureaucratic agency position and move aside so that you are not kind of muddying the waters or using your position as a point of advantage, and you can't solicit and receive political contributions. So the Hatch Act of 1939 is a very important act that's going to limit the political activities. Now, of course, if you're thinking, you're like, that seems like it's getting into First Amendment issues because we have the right to association and freedom of speech. And so there were some court cases that challenged some of the more restrictive components of this. But for the most part, a lot of this will stay in place, and the Hatch Act is still referred to. I've heard it be thrown around in the past 4 years as accusations fly of individuals who are violating the Hatch Act by using their position and their elevation in the public eye, their federal job to promote election activities. And the final one here is the the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978, another big one. Of course, there's smaller ones. The most recent one was in 2015, in which this is under the Carter administration. There's this major reorganization that happens where they're going to start to take some of those elected or appointed officials and create a whole kind of standout way of referring to them as the senior executive service. And so the federal government, especially when there's a change in administration, will publish this thing called the Plum Book. That's the PLUM book. It's called that because the cover is purple. And it has a list of all the vacancies that the president has to appoint in, as quickly as they possibly can. And that gets started as soon as the president, if not even before a president actually wins office, because that needs to roll and be done as quickly as possible. Those senior executive service individuals are critically important at taking the president's direction and moving forward with it. You can have acting individuals, but they really can't come up with new initiatives. They can't come up with new kind of proposals. They really have to stick to whatever the budget was. There's no like magical new ideas that might come through there. There's no major overhauls. So you want to get it done quickly. They also created a thing called the Office of Personnel Management, which is another bureaucratic agency that coordinates hiring, again, so that it's more merit-based and not about who you know or what favors you've done for people. And the final thing is that, yeah, a lot of federal employees who are below the senior executive service are in a union. And so there are agencies and boards that facilitate the collective bargaining issue with the federal unions. So lots of words there, right? Discretion, the bureaucracy has discretion in how they behave too. And so you see, because these individuals often spend a career in doing something, become subject matter experts, they really know the ins and outs of the process. They know what works, they know what doesn't work. You see, even with the senior executive service, a lot of them will feel pressure to do what their merit-based employees, those people who have been there, who are there between administrations and over many administrations, feel is the best way to go. And there will be structures that are created to assist those lower level bureaucrats to be able to convey that information. I know that one of the very famous things was a back channel that was found in the State Department where where the bureaucrats who were in the State Department who were overseas could, it's called a dissent channel, could communicate back to Washington, D.C. Concerns that they had about policy changes in the countries that they are working in. Another issue oftentimes you see is some street level bureaucrats. Those are individuals who are at the point of service. So they're working with the clients, the public, whatever that might be. And they're going to have a lot of discretion in how they're going to serve the public as well. So even if you have really stringent regulations and rules, there's still even going to be wiggle room in how you go about doing things, who you choose to help, who you choose to kind of just follow the standard operating procedures, so on and so forth. And our final thing here are standard operating procedures that are written by bureaucratic agencies to help with process-oriented decisions, like how do you get it from point A to point B? We talked a little bit about that yesterday. All of these things are there to create and to facilitate the execution of a political goal, not necessarily efficiency. We associate efficiency with private market bureaucracies, with corporations, in which it's very easy to let people go and to go in different directions and things of this nature. But a bureaucracy is a political organization that is created and hired to accomplish whatever a political goal is. And oftentimes those political goals are overarching and they thread into areas that you would never expect them. One of the best examples has to do with hiring practices in the federal government. There's a lot of requirements that have to be in place to ensure that minoritized communities have just as much of a chance to be able to get those positions. That's affirmative action. And those kinds of standard operating procedures, executive orders, and other presidential directives, rules, regulations, they are all going to, because it requires going to different offices, It's going to slow the process down. But if you are wondering why it might make the bureaucracy less responsive, remember that it's a political goal. It's not a business goal. They're not there to create, a product for you to buy on the free market. They are taxpayer dollars that are being earmarked by Congress to fulfill whatever political goal has been set out for that bureaucratic agency. And with that in mind, we get to how Congress affects the bureaucracy. So Congress, we said yesterday, they delegate authority. They're going to allow bureaucracies to create regulations and rules. I told you yesterday what the difference between them was. And then bureaucracies will go ahead and enforce those, right? So that makes them quasi-legislative. And sometimes in enforcement, when they're deciding fines and things like that, they might also be quasi-judicial. And we talked about that last class too. So a really great question here would be, this feels like it's violating the separation of powers when you're giving these authorities over to these executive agencies. And it would seem like that. But for the most part, Congress has decided, the Supreme Court has decided that Congress can delegate authority and use oversight to investigate. There are limits on how closely they can kind of pull back on the leash. For instance, things like legislative vetoes, that's too far of an entanglement and an enmeshment of separation of powers. But I mean, because there are some issues with that. We talked about that when we talked about war powers resolution. But for the most part, it seems like it, but the Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution to say that for the most part, there are some limits, but it's constitutional. So oversight also, we should remember, it's passive, right? And it's important. It is something where they're coming back in and they're looking at what's happening after the fact to make sure that whatever bureaucratic agency we're looking at, as they're enforcing laws or spending federal taxpayer dollars, that they're doing it as Congress intended. And that's what oversight allows them to do. So we do this through hearings. We are going to be running hearings out of, you can see oversight hearings out of standing subject matter committees, out of select or temporary committees that are created just to investigate one question, like the Benghazi committee back on the Obama administration. And you might even see them in standing committees like the Government Oversight Committee out of the House, where they have specific missions that they're there to ensure that things are happening. Our other component here is through appropriations. That is the authorization and appropriations bill, in which the president has the authority to veto it, right? It's presented as law. We talked about this a couple days ago. Remember appropriations bill? Seems like it's not, but it's a law. And they are there. Another critically important thing is it's not like Congress says, we have to fund the Department of Treasury. Let's give them $25 billion, spend it how you see fit. No. It's specific. It says you have to spend it in this office for this program, so on and so forth. Everything is very much so spelled out, almost, to the program level, to the policy level. Finally, you see legislative vetoes and this thing called committee clearance, where the committees, they might have to ask, you might find that that the senior executive service, the SES service, they might give Congress a courtesy by telling them, we're planning on going this direction to avoid some of the less comfortable parts of oversight, like taking people in public hearings and just raking them across the coals. And the last one here, and this is like a super important agency, a congressional agency that's been in the news recently, the Government Accountability Office. This is a bureaucratic agency whose entire position is to just investigate how federal spending has been affected by the bureaucracy. It's headed by a person known as the Comptroller General. Anybody can call and be like, hey, can you look into this? I just went there the other day and there's like a little thing at the bottom. It's like, do you have something to report? So the GAO right now is investigating how COVID-19 money has been spent. How does the president affect the bureaucracy? So powers of chief administrator come first into mind here because of the appointment process. Policy is personnel. Who you put in those positions because they do have discretion is super, super important, because presidents don't have the time to micromanage their individuals who are in charge of executing discrete functions. So they'll try to control them with executive orders and red tape, and firing. They like to fire appointees who fail to carry out the missions. But the most important way is to make sure you have the right person in there for the job, and that they're loyal to whatever the president's vision might be. Also, using things like their staff agency, the executive office of the president, is going to come in with expertise and give them recommendations. There's regulator reviews through the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. Kind of think of it like the GAO for the president. Executive orders and other presidential directives, and then the budgetary influence process through the Office of Management and Budget. By congressional law, there is a two-step process where the president is going to suggest a budget after 6 months of investigating how money was spent, and they will send it to Congress. And that gives the president a lot of not power, but influence over what the output out of Congress might be afterwards. How do the courts affect the bureaucracy? That's a great question. So we have litigation, right? Is our major standard here when we're talking about direct effect. So hearing cases and those things called amici briefs or amicus curiae briefs from the Solicitor General, who is the top lawyer who goes and argues before the Supreme Court. Their office is going to be the most important touchstone. And oftentimes the Solicitor General is asked to write amici briefs. And that is kind of tipping the scales a little bit, because there's a more regular professional relationship between the Solicitor General and the courts, Supreme Court. The other thing is lawsuits, right? Lawsuits brought by private individuals, companies, groups, special interest groups, so on and forth, against the United States or individual agencies, and the use of judicial review. So there's two major standards in how the court kind of referees these issues. If someone is going to accuse a bureaucratic agency of doing something wrong, they have to have substantial evidence that that agency veered too far beyond the delegated authority by Congress, and that then any damage that was done beyond the scope of the law was arbitrary and capricious, meaning like intentional and just nasty, right? Intentionally trying to hurt somebody. So the courts have looked at issues of separation of powers and checks and balances and the interplay of the three institutions, and they are still refereeing the lines between what's acceptable and what is not. And our final fail-safe, you know what it is. It's a whistleblower, right? So at any point in time, a way to get around all of this is that there are whistleblower protections that are written into the U.S. code that allow individuals who have access and knowledge of things happening that are incongruent with the U.S. Constitution, with congressional law, so on and so forth. There are abilities for them to be able to report that. And the way that the law currently stands is that any whistleblower from an executive agency has to be presented to the president, and then the president will hand it off to Congress, which, why don't you go back and listen to, I don't know, September 2019 through December 2019 for more information on that anywhere, really. Okay. Our guided practice, again, we're doing content application FRQ. Again, know your task verbs, critically important component. This is our post or our prompt. Again, this is something from me that I'm going to train you on, and I'm going to run through it so that you can see me do this live. I am going to, if you want to pause your video, now is a great time to do that while I stop my share. And I'm going to share elsewhere. Here we are, friends. Don't you love a good FRQ? All right, let's read this together. Okay, so this is a floor statement from Senate Democratic leader Harry Reid on the confirmation of Judge Samuel Alito. All right, so this is sounds like not a hearing, but just a floor statement, right? I rise today to explain the reasons I will vote against. Voting against the nomination of Samuel Alito. Judge Alito became President Bush's candidate to replace Sandra Day O'Connor after the radical right, that's some strong language, torpedoed the nomination. I see some rhetoric here, my AP Lit kids. The nomination of White House counsel Harriet Miers, and insisted that someone with Samuel Alito's ideology be put forward in her place. So right now, okay, we're talking about nomination. We're talking about SCOTUS. We are in the Senate, and I see the hint of ideology. And of course, because we're talking about ideology, party ID should be slid in there as well, right? So why is he able to talk with such rhetoric? Because he is the Senate Democratic leader, and so we're talking about partisan issues here. So it shouldn't be a shock that we see such strong language. This is 2006. It's not as polarized as it is today, but we're getting there, right? Okay. I continue to believe that Harriet Miers got a raw deal. The right wings distrust the right wing. That's another strong piece of rhetoric there. Distrust of Harriet Miers and their immediate elation when Judge Alito was named raised my suspicion the day he was nominated. Now, of course, we should note that Harriet Miers and Samuel Alito, they were both appointed by a Republican President Bush, okay? But one of them, their nomination was withdrawn. Those suspicions came to a height with Alito's 1985 application for a political job in the Reagan administration. In it, Alito stated, "I am and always have been a conservative." Again, we're back to party ID and political ideology. He spoke proudly of his work on behalf of the extreme agenda, more rhetoric of the Reagan Justice Department, his disagreement with landmark rulings of the Warren Court. We've talked about the Warren Court. Remember, we talked about they are drastically restructuring the relationship between federal and state governments. And we're going to talk more about them in a little bit, in a couple days here. All right, in favor of equal rights and his membership in right-wing organizations. This amounted to his pledge of allegiance to the conservative ideology. Fiery, fiery, fiery. All right, so let's read our A. Describe a power of the Senate Democrats. So we're looking at Senate Democrats, very specific group of people, right? In the Senate who have control and authority over being able to continue with this. So what could they use to address? So we're talking here about negative agenda control. So what are some of the things that are negative agenda control where the party can keep things from moving forward? One of the things that we had talked about is possibly having a party mounted filibuster. So let's talk about that. Senate Democrats can impede the nomination of Samuel Alito by calling, nope, that's not clean enough. Let's make this our verb, filibustering. Underline, period. We gotta do a describe and explain. Requires, now this is like a little bit of a, maybe this is like subject matter information. 2006, the cloture still needed to be broken by 60 of the 100. So that doesn't exist anymore because the Republicans got rid of that. But this is 2006. Republicans got rid of that in the Trump administration years. 60 of 100 senators to end a filibuster, which effectively halts any debate and vote on Alito's potential confirmation to the Supreme Court. So I have a lot of words in there that come out of this right up here, right? I talked a lot about confirmation, et cetera, right? We could even say of conservative appointed Samuel Alito, you know, you could pepper that in, but, you know, leave it up to you. B. In the context of this scenario, explain how the use of the Senate Democrats' power described in A can be affected by its interaction with a Republican president. So what can a Republican president do to get the Senate Democrats to stop filibustering? Okay. Well, the easiest one, because remember, we're doing low-hanging fruit. The Republican president, as we talked about at the top of this live, he can withdraw the nomination. Just like he did with Harriet Miers. As a Supreme Court justice. So now withdraw the nomination is our identify. So now we need to describe and explain why that works by here's our describe. Ending the efforts to get Alito confirmed and finding a new appointee. Why does that work? The president, the Republican president, right? Because this is more about party. President. Now let's think about this. What might they want? Find a more moderate Supreme Court justice nominee to appease Senate Democrats. Okay, C. Explain how the interaction between Senate Democrats and the president can be affected by conservative special interest groups. Oh, good one. Okay. What can they do? Well, they love to go public, right? They can go indirectly and go public, or they can go directly and they can do things like give, I don't know what that's there. Okay, never mind. They can give, you know, money to the president, so on and so forth. Let's say that they're going to go public. So we want to make sure we say which one. Conservative special interest groups can spend money to get the public to support Alito's nomination by spending money on ads. The special interest groups can counsel conservative Republicans to call their senators' offices in support of Alito. This would pressure an end to the filibuster. Boom. Boom, done, friends. We're boom done. Excellent. All right, let's see. We're gonna rocket through this really quickly, get back into our PowerPoint, finish up, and get moving for the day. Okie-doke. We're done, we're done, we're done. Here's our questions at the end of the day. Which of the following scenarios best illustrates a formal check on the power of bureaucracy? A, lobbyist representing NRA. B, Secretary of Defense calling to testify in the Congressional Committee. C, Chief of Staff censured by the President. D, a federal judge being impeached. Which one do you think it is? Think about it. Is B. As soon as you see testify, that the closest thing we're going to get there is that it is probably an oversight hearing. The role Congress plays in ensuring executive branch agencies are carrying out their legislative responsibilities is known as Simple definition, legislative oversight. You got it. All right, so we did all of the things. Oh my gosh. We have another FRQ. I think you haven't done this one. Now I'm all nervous. I don't think you have. Okay. I'm 2 days ahead of you guys, so I get them all confused. If not, let me know. And what that puts us at is we are going to start unit 3. So we're going to transition into courts next time. We are going to spend a little bit of time kind of going back and forth. We're going to look at both the SCOTUS FRQ to help us understand how to think about court cases, because they are fair game. Units 1 through 3 includes court cases, to help us understand and interpret Supreme Court or kind of concepts related to our rights. And I will also be weaving into that more content application FRQs and more argumentation FRQs. And that is it for today, my friends. I cannot wait to see you tomorrow. We will have so much fun, and I want you guys to pay attention because I'm so excited. We are going to have a special guest on Thursday. I will announce it on Twitter because I just want to, well, it's Valerie Jarrett. Oh my God, I'm so excited. So she is the former senior advisor to Barack Obama. I lied to you. I'm not going to tell you on Twitter. And she's going to come and spend some time with us. She has had the opportunity to look at all levels of government. She worked in the city of Chicago. She worked in business. She's done a bunch of stuff with nonprofits. She's working today to help engage Americans in their right to vote. So she has so much experience, so much vision to help us have and learn to think about having conversations about the things that we talk about in here, which is what's the most important thing. How do we talk? How do we think? How do we compromise? Yay. And so that's Thursday. And other than that, I'm going to say bye.